Have you ever wondered what's the difference between the terms Latino and Hispanic? Most people use these words interchangeably, but there is actually a difference. There is a huge overlap, i.e. most people who are Latino are also Hispanic, and vice versa, most people who are Hispanic are also Latino, but not everyone. But what exactly do these words mean? Unfortunately, like so many things, neither of these words have an official, universally accepted meaning. But let's start with the word Hispanic. The word's origin comes from the Latin word Hispanicus, meaning from Hispania, which was a former province of the Roman Empire. If you translate the word Hispania from Latin into English, you get the word Spain. This is because this is where the name of the country came from. The Spanish word for the country Spain is España. So the term Hispanic generally means things relating to Spain, people who are from or whose ancestry come from Spain or any other Spanish-speaking country. So this means that people from Spain are Hispanic, while people from Brazil or Portugal are not. Most Hispanic people speak Spanish as their native tongue, but it's not a requirement to speak it as your native language, or even at all, as long as your family originates from a Spanish-speaking country. So Hispanic would be people from any of these countries. Spain, plus the majority of Latin America, with the notable exception of Brazil, which speaks Portuguese. However, there is another Spanish-speaking country in the world, not in Europe or the Americas, but in Africa. Although the majority of Africa was colonised by the British and the French, there were small parts that were colonised by Spain, and there is one country in Africa in which Spanish is the primary official language, Equatorial Guinea. So are people from Equatorial Guinea Hispanic? Well, it may be a Spanish-speaking country, but their people would almost universally not be considered Hispanic. This is due to huge cultural differences and the fact that Africa was colonised much later than the Americas and in a very different way. Most Spanish people left after independence. And although Spanish is spoken by about 88% of the population, only about 10 to 15% have a high competence in the language. And remember how I said people of Portuguese descent were not Hispanic? Well, this is true in that most definitions exclude Portugal and that Hispanic only applies to Spanish-speaking countries, but an argument could be made that people of Portuguese descent are in fact Hispanic. Hear me out. The Roman province of Hispania consisted of the entire Iberian Peninsula, and so technically people from Portugal, and by extension Brazil, are originally from Hispania. In fact, in 1985, Tony Coelho of Portuguese descent applied to join the Congregational Hispanic Caucus, but he was denied entry. He then showed them a map of the Roman Empire, in which Hispania covered the whole Iberian Peninsula, so they let him in. Some dictionary definitions do include Portugal, but generally speaking, the term Hispanic does not refer to people of Portuguese descent. So moving on to Latino, while the term Hispanic includes people from Spain and excludes people from Brazil, Latino is basically the opposite. People from Brazil are Latino while people from Spain are not. The definition of the word itself is actually incredibly simple. It just means someone from Latin America. Easy. The problem comes from identifying where exactly Latin America is. Latin America is everywhere on the American continent that speaks a language derived from Latin, a Romance language. The term Latino in English comes from a shortened version of the Spanish word Latino Americano, meaning Latin American. However, this could cause some confusion because although the word Latino is an English word, it's also a Spanish word, meaning Latin. So for example, El Alfabeto Latino would be the Latin alphabet, or Países Latinos would be Latin countries, which could potentially refer to any country that speaks a Romance language. But people from, for example, Italy are not Latino because the word Latino in English means Latin American and Italy is in Europe, not in the Americas. So where exactly is Latin America? Obviously here in this general area, but where exactly? Some definitions are as broad as everything south of the United States in the Western Hemisphere, but this definition is far too inclusive. In Central America, there's Belize, which speaks English. There's plenty of English and Dutch-speaking countries and territories in the Caribbean, all of which should be excluded from Latin America. In South America, there's another English-speaking country, Guyana, and Guyana is bordered by Suriname, which was colonized by the Dutch, and bordering Suriname is French Guyana. So, should French Guyana be included within Latin America? Latin America is generally thought of as the Spanish-speaking countries in the Americas, plus Portuguese-speaking Brazil, while the other Romance language that exists on the continent, French, is often forgotten about. As well as French Guyana, there's also Haiti and the French West Indies in the Caribbean. In fact, the term Latin America actually originated from France. So Latin America would be Mexico, part of North America, all of Central America, excluding Belize, the majority of South America, excluding Guyana and Suriname, and in the Caribbean, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Haiti, and the French West Indies. So like I said, there is a huge overlap between the terms, which is why they're so often used interchangeably. But there are so many differing definitions of Latin America, most of which are, well, wrong. For example, Oxford Dictionary says that Latin America is the parts of the American continents where Spanish and Portuguese is the main national language, but this definition neglects the French-speaking parts. Merriam-Webster has two definitions, Spanish America and Brazil, but once again this excludes the French-speaking parts, and two, all of the Americas south of the United States. But like I said earlier, this definition is far too inclusive. Possibly the best definition is from dictionary.com, which defines Latin America as the part of the American continents south of the United States in which Spanish, Portuguese and French is officially spoken. But there are other factors which further complicate matters. Just because a country speaks a certain language doesn't mean the whole country does. The biggest example of this would be Quebec in Canada. The official languages in Canada are English and French, with English being the more widely spoken. However, in Quebec, the sole official language is French and is the dominant language in the province. So, should Quebec be considered part of Latin America? Possibly, although almost universally Quebec is not included within the definition, possibly due to the massive cultural and geographical differences. But on top of that, not all people within a Latin American country are Latin American. This is because many Latin American countries have a large indigenous population. There are more than 50 million people in Latin America of Amerindian descent, nearly 9% of the total population. The largest ethnic group of the indigenous peoples is the Quechua people, some of which can trace their roots back to the Incan Empire, the largest pre-Columbian civilization in the Americas, most well known for constructing the UNESCO World Heritage Site Machu Picchu. However, the majority of people in Latin America are a mix of both European and Amerindian descent, known as mestizo. Generally speaking, most people who are mestizo speak Spanish or Portuguese as their native language and would identify more with their European ancestry rather than their indigenous ancestry. Although one country which is an interesting exception to this is Paraguay. About 95% of Paraguay's population is mestizo, but the indigenous language of Guarani is actually more widely spoken than Spanish. Therefore, far more of the mestizo population would identify more with their indigenous roots rather than their European ancestry, compared with that of the rest of Latin America. So like so many things, the definition of exactly where Latin America is often comes down to convention rather than any strict criteria, and not everyone agrees on exactly where that definition is. The terms Latino and Hispanic are generally only used in the United States, so much so that some definitions limit its use to people who are actually living in the USA. The US Census Bureau asks a specific question relating to Latino Hispanic ethnicity, but the words are actually used interchangeably by the Census Bureau. The only reason it includes both words is due to regional use. Latino is more widely used in the western United States, while Hispanic is more common in the east. The term Hispanic was introduced by the Census Bureau in 1970, and its definition specifically stated that it referred only to Spanish speakers and background, although despite this, 1/6 of Brazilian immigrants identified as Hispanic. And that's just it. Census data relies solely on self-reporting, and ultimately that's exactly what ethnicity is all about, self-identification, and whether a person identifies with a specific culture which they want to be part of, or choose not to identify themselves in any way if they so choose. I think it was best summed up in an article by the Pew Research Center. Who's Hispanic? Anyone who says they are, and nobody who says they aren't. Thanks for watching.